Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session on the power and pitfalls of social media. We're very grateful today to be joined by two brilliant panelists for this conversation. Shay Williams is an undergraduate from University of Cambridge and has worked in social media management and digital marketing for more than 3 years and has a background with surrounding young people. Having been the first young Deputy Mayor and Youth Member of Parliament for her London borough, she is dedicated to giving young people a platform to voice their thoughts. Hi, Shay.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Nice to see you. And Emma Greenwood is a youth voice and climate activist from Manchester. She was Young Member of Parliament for Bury from 2019 to 2022 and co-founded the Manchester branch of the Youth Strike for Climate movement in 2019. More recently, Emma has been working with Curve, a new social media platform aiming to support movements and turn social media into a tool to support social progress. Hi, Emma.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Not at all, thanks for joining us. So my name's Ollie and I work at Global Action Plan here, and some of the work I'm involved in is our campaign, which is called End Surveillance Advertising to Children. And that is very much kind of looking at the underlying business model and the big drivers of some of the main social media platforms, particularly the kind of invasive and manipulative advertising model and all that spins from that. So that's why Gap is kind of interested in this world. Clearly, incredibly kind of deep, rich, controversial subject matter, lots to talk about, so we will crack on. And I just wanted to start by asking you both, old people like me often seem to think that social media is terrible for young people, how a bit like our parents used to think that cartoons were corrupting the minds of young kids. So give us your views on the opposite, on the flip side. Like what good comes from your own social media use and that of your peers? And Shay, should we start with you?
Yeah, of course. So social media, it can be used like for force of good. I think it definitely increases political knowledge and engagement. Like as we've seen, there's a lot more information on social media that can help us inform our own political opinions. And in that way, young people can get involved from earlier on as well. And then just generally with knowledge as well, young people can learn, can help with homeworking and help with other things as well. And along with that, connecting with other people as well. So like-minded people and being able to start communities or being able to start different organizations with people who are not necessarily in your immediate city or in your country as well. So social media is definitely can be used as a force for good.
Thanks, Shay. And Emma, do you recognise that? Do you have similar experiences?
Yeah, to be honest, I completely agree, and I think such a large part of it is the education aspect. And with my background in sort of climate activism, without social media, I probably wouldn't have known much about it because there is such little education within the current kind of system around politics and around climate change and around your ability to push for change and be someone who's active as a young person. And so in that sense, social media is this really powerful tool to connect and educate young people to fight for things which maybe past generations just hadn't had the ability or access to. And I think that's really why we've seen kind of the Youth Strike for Climate movement grow in the kind of back of Greta Thunberg, but also things like the Black Lives Matter movement, which really took off over the pandemic, and global movements like that are calling out injustices. I don't think without social media and without this kind of wide access to an international network of people, they would have been able to happen.
And do you think therefore that there's something about the speed of social media which is important here? Because, I mean, arguably lots of movements of that scale have built in the past, but they've taken a long time. And as you say, lots and lots of people might go years without ever hearing of them. So do you think speed is the kind of new and most powerful thing here? Emma, give that back to you.
I think speed can both be a good and bad thing in this sense, because it can be very kind of proactive in response to things you see on the news and injustices as they happen, which is much easier than having to, as you say, fight for something over 5 years to even get on people's radars. But equally, it means that as soon as it comes, it seems to go. And for some reason, the news cycle and that social media cycle over the pandemic seemed to accelerate by tenfold. And we had things like the crisis in Yemen, Pakistan, and all of these things, which obviously are really, really prominent and really important to tackle. But they seem to get their airtime for about a week on social media and then just disappear. And obviously the issues are still there. The human rights violations, the famines, the wars, they're all still going on, but all of a sudden people forget about them. And so I think it's good that they do come about quickly, but then it's maybe the problem we've got at the moment is the sustainability of that and making sure that people don't forget about it and that actually we do kind of carry on fighting for what we need.
Shay, is that something that you feel as well? And it strikes me as Emma was speaking there that we've all kind of, I don't know, adapted our profile to show solidarity with any given campaign at a given time, and then weeks later completely forgotten it ever happens, or certainly I speak for myself at that in that scenario anyway. But is that something you think is similarly kind of problematic, I suppose?
As I said, I completely agree with everything that Emma's saying, and I also think because with the quickness of social media, it can spread literally around the world, not just in your city or within your country as well. So that adds to the fact that things can be spread so quickly. But as Emma said, they can die down extremely, extremely quickly. And then also on the flip side as well, they can have a lasting impact, but sometimes that lasting impact is negative. So if we go on a micro level and somebody has given an opinion that off the bat that they don't necessarily in the future they might not necessarily agree with, or might be slightly controversial, or something that cancel culture that might get them cancelled, that stays there on social media, and you can delete the post but screenshots exist. So on one hand, the quickness of social media allows it to happen really quickly and globally, and then on the flip side, things can have a lasting impact and they can stay, but not always for the right reasons.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating element of it. And I sometimes wonder whether there's a really important part of kind of both growing up as a child and an adolescent, but also through into young adulthood, that is exploring your own mind and your opinions and changing your mind and interacting with different people and reading different things and being influenced by a range of ever-changing things. That means that you're going to completely think differently about one issue from 1 year to the next, maybe from 1 month to the next. And do you think it's a bit simplistic to say that was broadly okay in the pre-social media age because there was less sort of record of it, and now you have to be sort of more aware of that for fear of being kind of called out on it, or is that an old person oversimplifying things? What do you think, Shay?
I definitely think it's always been there. I think that the fact that it's just so easy to speak your opinions as soon as they come into your mind without necessarily thinking about the impact, the future impact it might have on career prospects in the future, or just immediate future. I do think that has social media has exacerbated that to an extent. But I do think the idea of being able to grow and have opinions that you might not necessarily agree with in the future, I think that's all there. I just think with social media, it's just much easier to get them out there as soon as you have them and not necessarily think about the consequences or possible backlash.
And Emma, have you, rather putting you on the spot here, but you've got any examples of things you wish you hadn't said or wish weren't on social media, or the opposite, things that you're really, really glad that you did say a couple of years ago or whatever?
I think weirdly I'm in this generation where we were raised on social media in that sense. I got Snapchat as soon as it came out because I was just in that age bracket where we were starting using it. But equally, I think we've always been raised knowing the dangers of social media. It was heavily drilled into us. And so I think I've always been relatively cautious with what I put on social media because there is, again, this element of cancel culture and accountability and the fact that it's completely public. So I've luckily, I don't think so far I've put anything on there where I look back and I go, oh no, I completely disagree with what I said there. But again, I think linking it to cancel culture, we sort of put unrealistic standards on social media. but also linking to people, in the sense that people make mistakes. They say things they disagree with in the heat of the moment or when they're angry, and anybody would do that in real life if you were speaking to someone. And it's just the fact that it's on social media and that there's this like hard copy proof that makes it an issue. And I don't necessarily think that is the best way to deal with something, is by just going, no, that's wrong, we're going to completely cancel you because 7 years ago you tweeted this thing which is now wrong. And it inhibits people's ability to learn, but also to be corrected on something that they had a misconception on because they're too scared to get anything wrong. And so I actually don't necessarily think that looking back on that and people saying and people sharing things that were wrong but then being corrected and acknowledging that is a bad thing. So it's a difficult bridge, I want to think, which people of my generation are going to have to increasingly grapple with, because as I said, from the age of 11 we've been online, and there's this pretty much going to be a whole life documentation of everything we've thought at any point, and that's quite a scary prospect to pair them with cancel culture.
Do you think then that potentially there's a bit too much attention on young people's use of social media in this context, in that, I mean, it sounds like from what you're saying, and certainly you see it, that young people are really engaged in a range of issues, thinking quite carefully about stuff, like actually engaging in the realities of why our culture is the way it is and all the rest of it. Whereas quite a lot of old people, and I'm thinking, some of our political leaders, are just sounding off, saying all sorts of completely untrue or reactionary things, and seemingly don't have any accountability. So should there be more of a sort of, if there's going to be a moral panic about social media, should it be more directed at the kind of older users of it who don't appear to have a filter and don't appear to be willing to learn? Do you think that's fair?
I mean, I suppose it's a difficult one, because even if they don't have social media, they're going to say it in real life. So in a sense, I suppose someone of an older generation sharing an opinion online that might be very much kind of either incorrect as an opinion or controversial or offensive in some sense, but then having the ability for younger people on the platform to then correct them. I think that in itself can be good to promote this sort of intergenerational collaboration of ideas and kind of push for social progress. So in that sense, it can be good, but equally you do then just get these echo chambers online of quite toxic opinions that perpetuate rather outdated ideals. And I think that's a difficult thing at the moment, is that if social media could be a tool to correct and share and educate, it'd be fine. But at the moment, that isn't really how it's equipped, with echo chambers and algorithms, which just kind of seem to keep people in their own little bubbles of like-minded opinions. And so in that sense, it can become quite a dangerous kind of mechanism.
Yeah, I think that's something which is becoming increasingly kind of well understood, and perhaps, the optimist in me thinks that maybe after 10, 15, 20 years of these platforms existing, we're starting now to see a bigger realization of their true power, and power for bad as well as power for good. And let's move on to that a little bit, because I mean, for all of the great examples of power for good, I suppose, that these platforms have, it's demonstrably the case that an awful lot of bad stuff, terrible stuff, happens and is amplified by social media. And the Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen revealed last year, I think now, in particular, that young women's mental health was known by Meta and Instagram to be worsened by their usage of Instagram, and that they did nothing about that knowledge. They sat on it because they didn't want to suffer the PR consequences. And we've also seen recently that the Molly Russell inquest has shown, the coroner there set out their belief that social media played a very significant role in her death. So it's a bit of a difficult and possibly unhelpfully binary question, but do you think the good of social media outweighs the bad, or vice versa, or is it just a lot more complicated than that? Shay, what do you think?
That's a good question. A very big question. I think I'm an optimist as well. So I do think the good of social media outweighs the bad, but it's about like the impact as well. So the impact that of like the bad social media has, that might be felt slightly more than the good that it has. So I think there's like two different ways to look at it. I think the fact that, just generally speaking, of technological advancement, social media has like led us in a more positive direction, but there's always going to be the bad. I don't think there is a world where social media will always like 100% be used for bad. But yeah, for good. I mean, sorry. So I think that's a very good question, but I do think the good does outweigh the bad. But that's not to say that the bad is not impactful in a sense. Like with all the things that you mentioned, it's like mental health. They're extremely, extremely real. We saw it like during the pandemic as well. Um, so the good does outweigh the bad, in my opinion, but the bad is still there, and it's something that needs to be addressed, definitely.
And do you think then that we hear more about the bad, which is kind of how news cycles have always worked, right? You know, bad news sells, and the compassionate,
Yeah.
calm, kind of loving news stories that we never hear about are actually much more prevalent than we're led to believe. Do you think potentially the same is true of social media, that in respect of young people, a lot of young people are using it really positively and enrichingly, and we don't really hear about it, and yet we hear about the horror stories when they come to light?
Yeah, I do think so. Like as you said, bad news sells essentially, and it's easier to spread. Like people love a story. Um, I know that on social media there are certain like settings that you can use to like um take out certain words that don't appear in your feed, but that is an extra step. So I do think social media it tends to like push more bad than good, and you do have to sometimes actively search for good. Like for example, on Instagram, I follow this page called like Daily Positive News or something like that, and they just share positive news all of the time. So I think it is an extra step to make sure that you are got to see good things on social media, but I don't think it's impossible. And I think if you do that groundwork and making it very intentional what you want to see on social media and blocking out those particular words or like particular phrases or things that you necessarily don't want to see when you open the app for the first time, then I think that's how you intentionally craft, or not necessarily reality, but how you make sure that you're seeing what you want to see on social media. And the bad that does sell, you're not necessarily seeing it or um, being a part of it, essentially. I do think it's an extra step, but it's a step that is feasible, essentially.
That's really interesting, and some of Gap's work on this area is quite sort of focused on the default state of these platforms, and whether, you know, by default the more extreme and engaging content will come to you, but if you take the measures you were just outlining, show that, you know, you can actually sort of filter things out and calm it down. Do you think then that majority of young people that you know and work with are kind of aware of the mechanics of how this stuff work, of how the algorithms are geared to promote anything which is most engaging, and often that's hateful content or extreme views on anything? And if they are aware of that, do you think on aggregate, you know, they take measures to try and change it, as you're describing, change their experience on social media to suit what they actually intentionally want to get from it?
Mm-hmm. Not necessarily. I think schools like now, especially secondary schools and primary schools, because a lot of people under the age of 11 do have access to internet and a phone and social media. Um, Schools are trying to push it. I see a lot in a lot of London schools. I mean, that's just where I know. It is being pushed, and a lot more about like safeguarding in regards to actual social media is occurring. But the platforms themselves don't necessarily show you that when you sign up. That's something that you would have to go out of your way to find. Like me finding out about how to switch off those certain words or whatever. That was, I think I went to a workshop. I just happened to go to a workshop about it, but that was because my interest was in social media. So that again, there is that extra step to find the way that you stop looking at those like things that you don't necessarily want to see. But I do see a push in schools for like safeguarding purposes to do teach their children how to do those types of things. But I definitely think like not all young people are in school, for example, and school is just like one element of this like, their child's life. So I do think it does need to be pushed in other areas, and I do think the platforms have a responsibility to show young people how to do that, especially when like you type your age and your date of birth, if you give the correct date of birth. But yeah, I do think social media platforms do have an obligation to make sure that young people do know about those toggles, as well as like, people in general, but specifically young people.
So Emma, do you find that in the people that you know and that you work with, your peers and your friends, that there is a sort of an interest in the way these platforms work, or an understanding of how they might be geared, the reason why you might get some sorts of content and your friends might get similar but different content, and how it all gets dialed up and dialed down, and is that a kind of active conversation?
I mean, I think the echo chamber is quite a big buzzword at the moment that a lot of young people know. So I definitely think there's this increasing awareness around the fact that your social media kind of For You page, your discovery page, isn't really it's not a coincidence. It's quite manufactured and engineered, and in that sense, it's meant to be linked to you. And so I definitely think there's awareness around that. But equally, I don't think a lot of young people are aware of how that can perpetuate certain things with that they believe on quite a subconscious level. And a lot of that I think stems from the fact that, as you say, to find out about kind of safety mechanisms on social media or abilities to block out certain words or block certain content, you have to go to workshops, you have to go and kind of seek it out. It isn't something that's on the mainstream curriculum, because a lot of time I think, and increasingly, schools are going at the moment, phones are bad, they can be used for bullying, they're a distraction for kids, so we're just going to ban them completely. And so you basically get this age gap of 11 to 16-year-olds who aren't allowed to use phones in school and never really get taught how to use them in a safe and effective and maybe sometimes kind of proactive way, because technology can be a really good tool for learning and for exploring and researching. But I think in a sense it's quite demonised. And so you get to this point where young people don't know how to use it to its best capabilities or in a safe way for kind of ourselves, but also for our mental health. And so at the moment, I think there's this quite a big gap around kind of education and technology, which is meaning that young people don't necessarily know how to use it in the safest or best way.
That's really, really fascinating. And I mean, I'd love to sort of talk to teachers about this as well, because you can totally imagine that you would reach for that solution, right? If you've got a class full of kids who seem distracted, or maybe you're, worse than that, you're worried about kids that might be getting bullied, or even worse than that, you can see how you would reach for the solution of, well, let's just get rid of phones. But yeah, I mean, if you're then missing out on the chance to help kids learn how to use them with moderation, or adopt certain kind of best practice usage in terms of safety, then that's potentially a bit of an own goal. Wow, that's really fascinating. So how then would you like to how would you like to see social media be different? Would you like to see social media be different? Do you think it's just, it's got some, you take the rough with the smooth, it's powerful and potentially dangerous but potentially fun, and it's fine and it's here to stay, or do you have specific things that you'd love to see differently? Emma, you kick off with that one.
I mean, this is basically why I started working with Curve, which is the sort of social media company that you said at the start, because I think social media has to change, and in essence it is changing, and we've seen that with Be Real. I don't know if you know what it is, but obviously that kind of really blew up over the summer, and it's this much more kind of casual form of social media that works to break down the perfectionist nature of posts on Instagram, which are really heavily edited, taken from a certain angle at a certain point, and it sort of works to take away from that. And I joined Curve in the same sense because I saw the power that social media held to bring people together and to help educate people and help people take action. And that was sort of the direction that the Instagram and platforms were going, but they're not made to support that. They're not made to help us as young people discover new things and broaden our horizons. They're made to kind of keep us in the circles that we've already established. And so I think in essence, social media has to change, and it probably will change. And I hope that it does, to kind of help people learn and grow in a safe and open environment that enables them to do that. And I definitely think we can see kind of that's maybe at the moment where the tide's going.
And do you think there are kind of, do you have a shopping list of specific things that you would love to see done differently, or is it such a big kind of fundamental thing that it's hard to be specific?
I mean, in essence, I think it's most things on social media that need to change. I think when it started, obviously, the world was just such a different place. It's practically, 15 years, realistically, that this is all completely blown up, and our entire lives is pretty much now revolves around the internet and social media in some sense. And so we need to come at it from a much more conscious point about what we need to do to benefit people's mental health, to kind of actually kind of act as a catalyst for change instead of being a negative one. And I just don't think we've ever really looked at social media and taken a step back and slowed down. Everything's grown so quickly and grown so mechanically, which has pretty much purely been driven by profit and wanting to get as many people as possible online. And actually, we need to take a step back and go, right, everyone's online already. That isn't something that we need to do. It's actually realising, right, how can we then get everyone who's on there doing it in the best way possible? And I think that's maybe the next kind of natural thing that needs to happen.
Shay, do you agree with that? Do you have a sort of sense of what how things could be different, or are you kind of more relaxed about the state of things?
I definitely agree with what Emma's saying. I think that the homogenization of all of these social media platforms, they're all starting to look quite similar. I think in that sense, with as Emma talked about, like storm of B real and that, and with those elements, like the idea that you can only take the picture once and it has to be very real and very raw image of what you're doing. I do think elements of that will be added to the other main social media platforms. I think it would have to be introduced gradually though, because with those other platforms, it's all about perfection, and then just switching like that may have an impact on mental health, because if young people or just people in general are used to like taking this particular photo like 4 times and then you have to only take it once, and so with those much bigger platforms such as Instagram and Snapchat and things like that, I do think that's a gradual process. In terms of like if there was something specific that I'd want social media platforms to do, I definitely think having like a mandatory sort of like tutorial when you sign up to the app. So this is how you block app content that you do not want to see. This is how you do this. This is how you do that. I think would be like a really good element to it. And then in terms of like in the actual structures of the social media, so like the people who work there and those types of things, I definitely think the algorithm could be better, and the reporting element of like reporting content that you don't want to see, or reporting racist or homophobic or sexist comments could be much smoother. Like a really good example when that didn't happen is like with the Euros in 2020 when I think Saka missed a penalty, and then like there were like a load of like really rude and offensive comments, and I know a lot of people reported it, but Instagram just did not deal with the situation as efficiently as it could have. So things like that in terms of the algorithm and reporting system definitely could be bettered and made like much more efficient. But yeah, I think definitely with people educating themselves as well, because like as Emma did say, like they're a money making corporation at the end of the day. So even if any of those things that I just mentioned didn't happen, then it's that personal responsibility to make sure that we are intent seeing what we want to see on social media. And if we're going to use it, we're going to use it for this and not necessarily see that we want to see. But again, that takes education, and it's not telling every person you definitely need to do that, because that takes time. So I do think elements of personal responsibility, as well as changing the algorithm, as well as like the homogenization of different platforms, meaning that change is probably going to happen quite soon.
Okay, so you are optimistic. You definitely reckon that good will win out. But you've also said that you recognise there are, if we're talking about, I don't know, Meta or Twitter or Snapchat or whoever, that they are profit driven, massive corporations who ultimately care most about the bottom line. So do you think that they are going to voluntarily change up their algorithms so that they cause less harm, or do you think they're going to just take a very cold hard look at their balance sheet and say, well, hateful content is making us plenty of cash, so we'll just carry on?
I think they will do at the same time. I think what they'll do is look at the balance sheets and realize that people are leaving the apps because of this content that they don't want to see. If it's something that's impacting their mental health, for example, then they're going to leave the app. And again, like the fact that a lot of these social media apps are the same, there's not necessarily a reason to have them. But I think it might be in the interest of profiting, retaining their audience, that they might change it. Whether we view that as a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not quite sure. But some people would say if it gets done at the end of the day, then if then so be it. So I do think it will change, and for the better, because of like the recent surge in things. They're talking about mental health and how like basically unhealthy these social media platforms can be at times. So I do think there will be a change, but perhaps in the interest of profit at the end of the day.
And Emma, do you think that these platforms are also slightly more vulnerable than we make them out to be? Because it strikes me that when a company is as big as Facebook or Meta is, it almost seems like they're untouchable. It's it's like a sort of Exxon or a, I don't know, any big oil company or a big tobacco company. You think they're too big, no one can touch them. But I mean, it strikes me a little bit from what you were saying, Shay, just now, that actually the power of young people to leave these platforms en masse would be really damaging. And certainly you see reports in the press that actually growth in these platforms is slowing. And I think for the first time ever recently, Facebook said they had a drop in numbers. Facebook itself is a platform for old people, right? Like, I mean, I don't know if that's how you experience it, but that's certainly how it's reported. So, do you think that actually the power of young people is really in where they choose to operate on these platforms, and as such they might be the thing that ultimately kind of forces these platforms to change, because if they don't, they won't be relevant and they won't be attractive to young people?
Definitely. I think we're the social media generation in essence. We're the ones that have grown up on it. We'll realistically use it for our entire life as a way to communicate. And we hold so much power in dictating what we want that to look like going forward. And as you said, the companies want profits, and the main way they get that is by people using it. And so where we decide to invest our time, invest our screen time, invest our usage is where they will develop and grow. And so I don't think that can be underestimated. And equally, I think every generation seems to have a new platform, whether it's sort of Facebook for more kind of for Gen X, whereas millennials are more kind of Instagram, and then you've got Gen Z on Snapchat and things. It's definitely there's a wave of new platforms coming, and it'll be interesting to see in the few years going forward kind of what there is for more kind of young people coming up who are definitely the more socially conscious and socially active generation, who've been raised with a lot more of the negative aspects of existing social media platforms in the news, and so are much more conscious about that than maybe we were. And so it'll be interesting to see how the platforms will have to change kind of by consumer demand and what we want.
And you've both mentioned the word perfection at various points in this chat, and it's a thing which is probably one of the biggest critiques of social media, is this idea that all of us present an image of ourselves which is the idealized version of our life and isn't necessarily representative of how we live. And possibly much more powerful and much more impactful than that is that celebrities who have these literally kind of unattainable lifestyles or unattainable levels of wealth or perfection or looks or status or whatever set these standards with which we are kind of comparing ourselves. And I think compare and despair is the phrase I've heard that best sums that up most pithily. Do you think that's still a kind of a relevant and current critique, or do you think the movement towards platforms like Be Real is gathering steam, and that young people and the youngest users of social media don't actually believe the kind of visions of perfection that they see? Shay, what do you think?
I think the idea of perfection is still there. I do think it takes a level of, I would say, maturity to realize that, that what you see on social media is not necessarily like be all and end all. Like people, even celebrities, they have a great day every single day, and what you see, they post twice a day. There's still like however many hours that you don't see what they're doing. Again, with that takes time, it takes education. It's not like I'm blaming young people for not necessarily knowing that, because again, it comes with time. I do hope that there will be a move with young people realizing maybe slightly earlier on, because like with young people having that ability to access social media from early on, then these lessons need to happen from earlier on. To answer the question, I do hope there will be a move for young people to realize that. I don't necessarily think it will happen immediately. But again, with this like current talks on mental health and I do see quite a lot of celebrities, like, when you can go on lives as well. Like this, they don't necessarily like make up on and stuff for lives, and I do see like quite a few more celebrities featuring their everyday lives as well, not necessarily like just the glitz and glamour of like, I don't know, award shows or something. You do see them like, a bit more, like having a bit more everyday. So I don't necessarily think it's the responsibility of the celebrities, but they are like doing it slightly more, which is having a positive impact. And then again, that education from an earlier age, yeah, definitely needs to occur. I do hope will be a change, but I don't necessarily think it's the responsibility of those individuals. But yeah.
Emma, what do you think? What's your view of the compare and despair dynamic?
I mean, to be honest, completely echo what was just said, in the sense that I do think there's a shift at the moment where people are more aware of how perfect social media is. And I think it actually is this culture at the moment where celebrities are promoted to be a bit more casual online. And that's something we've only really seen over the last few years. So it shows that there's definitely a mandate coming from that, from young people and the people using the platform. But equally, I still think that in a weird sense, we've almost perfectionized imperfection. Because we've sort of like you have like the self-care movement, which is where you're supposed to just, look after yourself, take some time off, as somehow being perfectionized and being made to be this really commercial thing where it needs to look really aesthetic with all the candles. And I'm like, everything at the moment, I think, just because of the mechanisms that social media is and because of the algorithm, it's made to be a certain way. And I think that culture is always going to be there until we decide to change it. And so whilst I think celebrities kind of being more casual is definitely helping, I think there's going to need to be a bit of a wider scale shift just within ourselves as people and how we use social media, but the culture as a whole to sort of shift the focus and the perspective, because there still is at the moment just this pressure to be picture perfect at every moment, even when you don't need to be. And so I think that's something that will require a much bigger scale change, but it's definitely kind of, I think, coming in ripples slowly.
So the platforms almost can't help themselves. It's a sort of capitalism will find a way, and that's kind of depressing, actually, isn't it? When you think about the perfectionism of imperfection.
It is, but equally, I do think that, like, obviously you can feel doom and gloom, but I do think things are moving in the right direction, and you can begin to see that, and that's what we need to hold on to, is the power that we're holding at the moment to cause that change, because kind of 3 years ago, you never would have seen the Kardashians doing a casual Instagram photo dump, whereas now they're sort of regular things, and so there is this move on social media to do that, but it's just making sure that we kind of do that and start to do it on a bigger scale, and that's the power, I think, that kind of young people and people watching this hold.
So Shay, final question from me. If you were able to transport yourself back to the day that you opened your first social media account, what was your first social media account, out of interest?
Good question. I think it was Facebook, actually. Yeah, I think it was Facebook. And then my parents found out I had Facebook and I got in trouble. Yeah, I think it's Facebook, yeah.
Okay, so take yourself back to the day that you opened your Facebook account. What, given what you've experienced since and what you've learned and what your peers have been through, what bit of advice would you give to that version of yourself on that day?
I think I would tell my younger self to properly understand the consequences and like what you're doing with social media. When you open this platform, what are you really there to do? Yeah, I think that's what I would tell my younger self. I'm pretty sure I opened it just because my friends had it and I just wanted to, be part of it. But again, with that, there are still dangers with social media, and they have age restrictions for a reason. So yeah, definitely to make sure internally understand why you're using this platform. Do you properly understand the dangers of this platform and like what you could potentially be seeing that wouldn't be appropriate for a young person to see? And I think that's probably the reason I got in trouble when I was younger having it. I don't necessarily think I understood the consequences that having these social media platforms could have and the damage that it could do for a person at such a young age. I think I was maybe 11. I think the age restriction is 13, but I think I was 11, yeah.
And Emma, what about you? And I suppose in addition, what might you say to Mark Zuckerberg or to any of the other kind of tech bros who have profited wildly from these systems? What would you say to them?
Yeah, so I think my first social media platform was Snapchat, way back in, I think it was like 2014. So it was very much in the heydays of Snapchat, and it was just people in my year getting it and wanting to be, you know, part of the club. Um, and again, I think I just echo the fact that you don't need to be on social media, and especially don't need to be on it all the time. And you don't need to document everything. You don't need to always be available to absolutely everyone at every time of the day. It's okay to come off. And I think like Snapchat streaks were a really kind of big part of creating that culture. And I think the impact that can have when you're young and a very formative age of forming habits is probably quite under researched. So it's just something to be aware of. And echoing that of telling kind of tech CEOs is that you need to create apps and think about the impact, but kind of the impact outside of profits, the impact on especially young people using it, and the habits and culture that creates, and the world that creates for them to be raised in. Because we're in a technological world at the moment, and I think as much as the world exists in real life, it exists online, and kind of they have the power to create entirely what that looks like for generations, and that is an awful lot of power to have. And I think it needs to be much more conscious with how you're shaping that, and every decision you make does have an impact. And it's thinking, I think, on a much wider scale about that globally, and on the different demographics that will inevitably use it, even if you do have an age guidance sort of thing, which obviously is not necessarily always followed.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much for your time and your insights, and for all the work you're doing. Emma, you mentioned Curve. Do you want to say anything a bit more about that and how people can find out more about it?
I was going to say you can find Curve on, ironically, Instagram, but that's we're only on there to get you off there. That's what we say. So you can find us online. We've also got a website, and Curve is basically a new social media platform focused more around movements and people and groups trying to do things. So we have like a book club movement. Fridays for Future's got one. We've got a food one, and it's basically creating community pages that individuals can post to, but it's there to help you meet people outside of an echo chamber, and you can get involved in things that you have loads of interest in, or things that you've never been involved in, like outdoor adventures. And it's just trying to reimagine social media in a way that kind of supports our mental health and enables you to do good and use social media in a much more positive way. So I mean, it'll probably be a cool thing to check out, just to see if that's the direction that social media is going. But equally, there's a really cool network of people on there that I think you'd definitely be worth checking out.
Brilliant stuff. And that's CURV, no E, is that right?
Yeah, CURV.
Okay. And Shay, you've got a blog that you write on these sorts of things, is that right? How can people find it? Should they find it, or do you want to keep it completely hidden and no one ever to read it?
Yes, I have a blog that I talk about all things young people, essentially. So we talk about social media as well as like educational things, and how you can, have that ability to like be confident when you're approaching older people as well, and just what you can make as a young person. It's on the platform called Medium, and my username is called Imani Shay. So my middle name and my first name. And yeah, if you just follow that, and in the comments you can always like have a really good discussion, a really engaging discussion about the topic that I've written about. So it's a really, really good platform to use, generally speaking. But yeah, on Medium.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, both of you, and really great to meet you, and best of luck in everything that you're up to.